So thank you for inviting me. I'm thrilled to be here. This talk, as you're going to find out, is a little bit idiosyncratic in some ways. And I want to start off by just acknowledging my son Stefan and my brother Nils, both of whom have been major supporters of this long journey I've been on. My son was 5 years old when we exhumed his grandfather's body, which from a developmental psychological perspective is not exactly recommended. If any of you are contemplating digging up grandfather, I would caution you against it, especially if you have a young child. And my brother, who's been a kind of silent partner in this whole thing for a very long time. Speaking of Stefan, my son, who is now 28, he sent me just as recently as last night this image that he'd found, I think yesterday, on the web somewhere about the creepiest hotels in America. Number 5 turns out to be the Hotel Pennsylvania, which is, as you'll see from the last sentence there, the place where Frank Olson mysteriously died in the early 1950s. So this is a Halloween kind of commemoration. So this story has genuinely entered the zeitgeist. The other thing I wanted to do here is just acknowledge the significance of London. I mean, it's very kind of moving for me to be talking about this in London, because on the one hand, London was a place where a very well-known MI6 psychiatrist named William Sargent betrayed my father to the CIA, which led to his murder. On the other hand, it's where Sigmund Freud came in 1938 to Maresfield Gardens, number 20, and died the following year, but started this tradition of psychoanalysis in England and particularly in London, which has been extremely innovative, very diverse, still thriving, still vigorous, and has influenced me a lot in one strand of what I'm going to talk about today. So it's very moving to be here for both of those reasons. So what I wanted to do here was trace a series of what I'm calling moments, and the trajectory here is probably too ambitious for the time that we have, but nevertheless I wanted to see if I could kind of follow the whole logic of this thing, which leads from this early childhood experience of mine, my father's death, and along the way kind of picks up this notion of collage, and which became very important to me, not only personally but also professionally and intellectually, and led me to try to develop something which I began calling the Collage Method. I'm not really fond of that term, as you'll see as we get further on, but it'll do for the moment. So the pathway here through these moments, and they're going to be mostly fairly brief, but and we could obviously drill down into any of them and spend a day on each point here. But the first sort of general area is going to deal with the personal and historical background of this whole matter. The second is going to be implications that I drew out for kind of theory and method, which led to this transformative method, which kind of rose like a phoenix out of the smoldering pyre of my father's murder. But like a very slow-moving phoenix, it took years, in fact decades, to be fully borne aloft. So I want to kind of give some sense of that. And then third, the final moments, 16, 17, 18, is a swerve back into the heart of the Frank Olson story, and why I am very disappointed with Wormwood, particularly the ending of it. How many of you have seen Wormwood, by the way, though? Oh, most of you have seen it. Okay. Well, those who haven't, can see it easily on Netflix. But anyway, the final episode of it I found extremely disappointing. This interview with Seymour Hersh, which was kind of a mess, very confusing. And what I want to do at the end here is describe what actually happened in the encounter that took place in 2014 with Seymour Hersh, what he actually discovered, why, for me, it was the end of the whole affair, which is not clear from the film. for various reasons that we could talk about. So we start here now on this trajectory with a kind of a prologue where my life has really been propelled by two questions, which in turn spawned a third. The first one is, how did my father die? The second one, what is a collage? And the third question is, what's the connection between these two questions? From as far back as I can remember, the thought of my father's death has been inseparable from notions of montage and collage. There was never a single reason for this linkage. In the beginning, it probably centered on the idea of the shattering glass, the proliferating shards as he took flight. Or perhaps the key to it was the image of my father's body, fractured and fragmented by the fall. The coffin was closed, which left the unconscious wide open. Perhaps the collage aspect derived from the brain-numbing primal scene in a hotel room itself, the incommensurable pieces of the story of what had happened just before he went out the window splintered the mind of anyone who heard it. And I was never able to render it as a single image. The scene was ungraspable, unfathomable, unimageable. The fragments were juxtaposable, collageable, but not thinkable and certainly not narratable. And this quotation from Schwitter's has always been, very important for me in kind of capturing this sense of something, broken and shattered. But the ungraspable aspect of it all has accounted for why I've held on to these questions for so long with a tenacity which has prompted some to call me obsessed. For me, the questions have simply seemed too important, too hard, and too tightly braided to let them go. The interlace of these questions, what happened to my father, how did he die, and what is a collage is really my story. It's a series of chiasmic moments where the questions again and again intersect, coming always from different directions. So the moment one here, your father's had an accident. Sometimes I think my life began not when I was born, but when I was awakened before dawn on November 28, 1953, at the age of 9, to be given the news that my father had an accident. It was a bit like James Agee's classic novel from a couple of years later, A Death in a Family, except that Rufus, a bit younger than me, stunned and bereft as he was when he was awakened with the news that his father had died, at least knew what a car accident was. I was simply awakened in the pre-dawn of a November night to be told, your father has had an accident, he fell or jumped out the window of a hotel in New York, he died. It wouldn't be much of a stretch to say that I've been trying to parse that piece of news ever since. During most of my childhood, I was in a kind of a semi-stupor, understanding nothing. 2 decades later, I was finally making progress, at least in having developed interests and energies that compensated for a lost childhood. That was when I was hit with the news, the next wave of fake news actually, which bowled me over again. This was an article on the front page of the Washington Post in 1975. 9 is a delicate age, the late afternoon of childhood, one writer called it, and a particularly bad time to have the world fall apart. I never got any explanation for me that made a bit of sense about what had happened to my father. One day he was there, the next day he wasn't. That meant that for me, the whole notion of cause and effect, the notion that the world made sense, collapsed. I never saw his body, no one did. He was returned in a coffin, which we were advised not to open. That meant that the boundary between presence and absence, between the palpable and the ineffable, the very basis of language itself, was blurred. No one spoke about what happened in a way that connected either to the event itself or to the emotions that should have followed. What took their place was the grim insistence to, quote, move on. Move on to what? To where? Move on to the demonstration that we could in fact move on. As a family, we became fierce exemplars of what's now known as resilience. My own strategy for survival was twofold. On the one hand, I was outwardly driven by a relentless focus on various projects and goals that seemed to distract me. I became the youngest Eagle Scout the troop ever had, weighed down by a heavy sash loaded with merit badges. Later, as a lad of 16, I bicycled across the country with my 12-year-old brother. Anything, as Tolstoy once said about his own childhood, to avoid thinking about the white bear. On the other hand, I followed a more internal, unconscious agenda, driven by questions I didn't even know how to ask, unrecognized as a quest at all, not to mention one connected with my father's death. The instruments for this second strand were my father's camera, a Kodak Retina, and an enlarger given to me by none other than my father's boss. Moment 2, the family in ruins. If the family had no idea what had hit us, it turns out there was a good reason why we didn't. My father's death wasn't just a secret murder disguised first as an accident and then later as an LSD suicide. It was a covert operation carried out within the family. The whole idea of a covert operation is to create an historical discontinuity so that it becomes possible to push Humpty Dumpty off the wall in such a way that the king's horses and all the king's men can't put Humpty together again. It's what I call the insidious ontology of covert operations. As for me, I lost my mind, or as my mother said, I tuned out, spaced out, dropped out. My relation with my mother had been weak from birth. I was the oldest of 3, and she'd had a difficult time adjusting to motherhood. She'd had 2 miscarriages before I was born. So I bonded very strongly with my father, but now he was gone. Inexplicably gone. The awkward vacuum surrounding his death, his disappearance really, comprised a taboo subject which drove us further apart. My father was not dead, he was permanently absent, disappeared, as they say in Latin America. My mother was unable to answer any of my questions or those of her own father, a stern congregational minister who suspected she must be hiding something and made her feel guilty for withholding information, which in fact she of course did not have. My father's boss, Vin Rouet, became her minder, visiting daily as instructed by the director of the CIA himself, Alan Dulles, to keep track of her, an assignment which he carried out with the aid of afternoon cocktails. In congressional testimony in 1975, Rouet would say that he had never lied to Mrs. Olson, but had merely allowed her to think things that were not true. You can hear her saying that. You can hear him saying that in a clip from Wormwood.
Talk to him.
That's my mother.
Fine discussion. Everything was, we will see you tomorrow. It was not a goodbye. That was the one thing that consoled me, was that I knew this could not have been an intentional act because he did not call up to say goodbye. It was, I will see you tomorrow.
Certainly. Something has troubled me. I never recall having told Mrs. Olson anything that was flatly untrue. I did allow her to think things that were not true. I just would like to have that put on the record that I do regret it.
Well, that's a very honorable gesture.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, this Rouet character is going to figure in the later story I'm going to tell from what Seymour Hersh discovered, all those 40 years later, but we'll come to that. So we never visited my father's grave or went through any sort of family mourning or grieving. It was all too scary for that. In the years that followed, my mother's alcoholism worsened, but my mother, sister, and I had no idea at all that she was drinking. In a well-known feint among alcoholics, she hid the vodka bottles in a water tank of the toilet in her bathroom that kept them both hidden and cool. We knew that sometimes she became volatile and explosive, but we had no idea what was going on. In the face of all this, I became incredibly driven. So this is my brother and I, as we prepare in 1961 to take off across the United States on these terrible bicycles. which we finally replaced once we took a look at the Rocky Mountains and thought we needed something better. And here we are when we finally made it to San Francisco. And here we are in the Oakland Tribune. In the aftermath of my father's death/disappearance, I descended into some kind of dissociative amnesia. In a sense, I became Jason Bourne, whose own father, as it turns out, in the fourth film of that franchise, was also murdered on the command of the director of the CIA after becoming a critic of disavowed programs. It was as if I too were caught in a mind-boggling, mind-destroying experiment, losing a sense of self, forgetting who I had been or who I might become, substituting frenetic energy for bodily knowledge and self-confidence. We thought we were fine. We were ordinary people. We had to be. But we were also taboo. We were unconscious carriers of forbidden knowledge. The family's closest friends either knew the truth or knew that they shouldn't know it. We didn't know it, of course, nor did we know that we were a threat. Our questions, if we had had the presence of mind to formulate them and the courage to voice them, would have rattled all my father's former colleagues to their bones, because they either knew the truth or knew that they didn't know it and shouldn't know it and didn't want to know it. The family's strategy in the face of an event we didn't understand and a revision in our social position which we couldn't perceive was to remain ordinary people, but now ordinary people with a vengeance. What I did was to go into the closet and pull out my father's Kodak Retina camera, which was sitting on a shelf. Suddenly my father's camera was mine. Later on, I paired the camera with some stuff my father's bought, the same vignette you just saw, some stuff he gave me, which included a photo enlarger and a power jigsaw. I didn't realize that I had been given a sort of kit for puzzle making, but that's really what it was. I headed down to the darkroom and headed down to the cellar and set up a darkroom. I didn't yet have the word montage, but my particular fascination was in making separate images appear together on a single piece of photo enlargement paper with all the separate images positioned as I wanted them to be and each exposed correctly. This required making elaborate screens to block the light from everywhere on the paper except the one place where I wanted to put an image, and then repeating that process with all the other locations where the image should be placed. Even if it was produced by an awkward process of exposing and blocking, I wanted the final configuration to appear seamless. I rarely succeeded, but when I did, I felt an eruption of satisfaction, as if heterogeneous and discrepant pieces could find a place of reconciliation and repose. For me, though, the space between was more than simply the gap between specific images in which the crucial one to be interpolated was missing. In my case, the space between represented the gap between two very different stories between which I was caught. As a photographer Minor White said in a quote you can read here, speaking of juxtapositions of photographs, the meaning appears in the space between the images, in the mood they raise in the beholder. Many years later, when I saw Antonioni's film Blow Up, that was filmed obviously very near here, I recognized that I too had been trying, however unconsciously, to solve a murder in a darkroom. We didn't visit the grave because we didn't know what emotions we should have if we did, and we didn't acknowledge missing my father at all. I quickly stopped thinking about him altogether. Instead, I thought about the two terms which comprised the sum total of the story I had been given. My father either fell or jumped out the window. Fell or jumped. I couldn't move beyond that binary opposition, and it was as if my entire cognitive apparatus was impaled on the horns of a dilemma I couldn't resolve and an image I couldn't bring into focus. What does it mean to fall through a closed window? And on the other hand, how does one jump through it? What does that look like? The worst part was that I didn't even know this question was on my mind. It became like a background fog, the unchanging weather in which I lived, but which I couldn't perceive. Actually, I suspect it was the only thing I was really thinking about. And of course, I didn't even imagine that there might be other supplementary terms buried in that opposition. It would take years, even decades, to find the courage and the cognitive power to expand that binary. The reissue of the Manchurian Candidate in 1988 was a crucial moment in that cognitive progression. Soon after moving to Cambridge, Massachusetts to begin graduate school in the summer of 1970, I run into an old college friend in Harvard Square. We have dinner together, and then my friend suggests that we each make collages from a pile of magazines she has collected. I throw myself into the task of making a collage with complete absorption and with that peculiar combination of alert decision-making and unconscious propulsion that the collage making induces. In the center of the collage that I make is a picture of a man falling from a high building. Did I know when I assembled the collage that the falling man represented my father? Yes, of course, or perhaps the right answer is yes, in a way. It's a bit like those experiments with patients in whom the connections between left and right brain have been surgically severed. With the left hand, the right hemisphere, they can recognize and reach for an object when invited to do so, an object which the left hemisphere, however, is unable to name, which means that they both know and don't know what the object is. In my case, what was missing was not the name, but the acknowledgement of the centrality of the image, that nearly two decades later, my father's unfathomable death remained at the core of my psychic organization. 5 years later, the story would explode. This is the front page of the Washington Post, June 11, 1975, when they published a story saying that a scientist unnamed in the article, which is very important, unnamed in the article, had committed suicide after being unwittingly drugged with LSD. The story did nothing to resolve my questions and my doubts. In fact, it intensified them, not least because the story, which was supposedly the big reveal, kept my father's name secret, as did the Rockefeller Commission report on which the story was based. I've often said that the headline, "Suicide Reveal," was doubly ironic. First, because it turned out this wasn't a suicide at all, but also because it wasn't revealed. Like a long-lost POW, the story didn't lead anybody at the CIA to contact the family with the news before we read it in the newspaper, and had to surmise and speculate that it referred to my father. When we figured it out and held a press conference, however, to announce that the unnamed scientist was in fact Frank Olson, we were immediately invited to the White House to receive an apology from the President of the United States. As it turns out, the only apology in the history of the United States from George Washington to Donald Trump, which has ever been given to anybody in the Oval Office for the unintended consequence of a government operation. Had we been alert to the uniqueness of that experience, we would have maybe asked some more questions about what the heck was going on. But it was already becoming clear that the story we had gotten was not right. Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld had already intervened to put a lid on the story. They were, in fact, the senior aides to Gerald Ford, who had become president after Watergate. As we will see, a quarter of a century later, 2002, Cheney would appear again in this story. And this leads ahead to the Cy Hirsch intervention. But it would take another decade for us to get a glimpse of that second intervention. We'll come to all that in a bit, because that's what I want to talk about in this startling moment at the end. What was already clear in 1975 was that the documents that we had been given by CIA Director William Colby, and I might add, from his hand directly on the 7th floor office of the director of the CIA, before which we had had lunch in his executive dining room. Again, a privilege that very few people actually have. But this is a story that appeared in the Times, where they kind of deconstructed the documents and found them to be totally lacking. Taken as a whole, the file was a jumble of deletions, conflicting statements, unintelligible passages, and some unexplained terms, as the Artichoke Committee and the Project Bluebird that tend to confuse more than enlighten. And that's sort of a kind appraisal of what these documents actually were. They were completely befuddling at best. Moment 6, interstices. In my teenage years, I was like the photographer in Antonioni's 1966 film Blow Up, who inadvertently photographs a mirror in the background of a fashion shoot in a park, but doesn't realize what he's got. Blow Up is, of course, the classic depiction in film of relationship of montage to an unrepresentable murder. Again and again, Thomas, David Hemmings, pins enlargements to the wall, moves them around, realizes that some interstitial image is missing, and returns to the darkroom again to print another shot. But however he montages the images, what he's looking for can't be seen in a single image. The elusive image remains interstitial, caught in the space between. For me, though, the space between was more than simply the gap between specific images in which the crucial one to be interpolated was missing. In my case, the space between represented the gap between two very different stories which I was given. Soon after my father died, I began watching a TV series called I Led 3 Lives. I Led 3 Lives was based on a true story about a guy named Herbert Philbrick, who had an outward life as a white-collar worker, an advertising executive in a real story, a second secret life as a communist agent, and an even more secret life as an FBI operative helping foil communist plots. The storylines were often rather absurd. All I really remember is an uncanny feeling of dread as I watched the programs. In the last few years, I got exactly the same sense of dread as I watched The Americans, only now the dread was enormously magnified because I knew exactly what was at stake in me and the plot. The Americans is based upon this notion of irreconcilable existential location, a suburban family drama which is at the same time the story of horrifying nighttime acts of espionage and sabotage by Russian agents living in a Northern Virginia suburb as ordinary Americans, and right across the street, as it turns out, from an FBI agent working on counterintelligence. Central to the anxiety and dread which The Americans induces is the notion of a mask. As the daughter discovers, and their son will eventually learn, the parents are completely different from how they appear in family life. And I started to think that my own life was like a series of juxtapositions of various films. Ordinary People, a Robert Redford film, meets 3 Days of the Condor, also a Redford film. It's a Wonderful Life meets Marathon Man. Or a show I used to watch, Robert Cummings as a photographer and Love That Bob from the late 1950s meets Costa Garva's Missing. Or maybe Ozzie and Harriet, a favorite family drama from that period, meets Conspiracy Theory. Paul Tillich, the theologian, once said that the boundary is the best place for acquiring knowledge, but it's a difficult and dangerous place to live. And I would agree with both of those sentiments. So now we come to moment 9, Feller Jump Revisited. In the wake of the disclosures about the alleged role of LSD in my father's death, the vexed issue of Feller Jump did not go away from me. In fact, it seemed to, as I ruminated on this opposition even more intently, it seemed to intensify, but in a different way. Now the collage work was drawn into it. A patient with whom I worked at the time had an annoying habit of posing a question I couldn't answer. If two things are both the same, she asked, what's the difference? My own journey would become a kind of prolonged tutorial in this conundrum. Fell, or jumped. In the 1980s and early 90s, there was a constant back and forth traffic in my mind between my thoughts about what had happened to my father on the one hand and what I was learning about the collage process on the other. One of the nodal points of this traffic had to do with what I began calling an impacted binary. By this I meant a choice which seemed to have two alternatives, like fell or jump, but which actually harbored more. The impacted effect was a kind of clotting of semantic flow caused by the pressure of other latent possibilities behind the explicit opposition. From the collage work, I had realized that even the simplest either-or can be immediately expanded to a four-term structure. It can be phrased as or either. That is, the starting point, the default, so to speak, can be reversed, which gives us a new pairing. This is not a trivial difference. The other term, the marked one, then represents a change and is therefore different even while remaining the same. The collage constructions always seem to contain precisely such a feature, where a key image could be present or absent, visible or hidden in one position or another. If one toggled back and forth in this flip-flop, the whole configuration was immediately revalorized. It was as if there were really two collages, two life-space maps imperceptibly laminated on top of each other, which were controlled by a central switch, such that one could pass from one landscape to a different one. Hey, we're not in Kansas anymore. Simply by flipping that switch. I began calling the switch a linchpin symbol. And it turns out that there's an answer to the question of if two things are both the same, what's the difference? And it comes from one of the most important linguists in the 20th century. Exactly at the point of such toggling back and forth, something more complex and interesting begins to happen. Instead of disclosing a simple either-or option, one landscape or another, the toggling seems inevitably to reveal another one. Just as presence-absence has one set of meanings if one begins with presence and switches to absence, and another set if one begins with absence and switches to presence, so also when such switches are embedded in an image configuration, the toggling action discloses concealed binaries. At that point, I return to my own collage, my own impacted binary, and the old question of fell or jumped. If there was ever a frozen binary, it was certainly the fell or jump flip-flop. And I finally began to realize that you could have fell or jumped, you could also have jumped or fell, and that these were two different things. The literary scholar Barbara Johnson, who unfortunately died all too young, in one of her essays says this: here again, what is constantly seen in terms of a binary opposition, white versus black, man versus woman, must be redrawn as at least a tetrapolar structure. And that's the kind of thing that I was beginning first intuitively and then more structurally to understand. That you had actually a quaternary structure here. So the question is, how do you get from an impacted, repetitive binary to a tetrapolar structure? As I wrestled with that question in the late 1980s, fate seemed to take a hand. An external event intervened. The Manchurian Candidate, out of circulation for 2 decades, was re-released. When I finally saw it, the frozen binary in my head, did my father fall or jump, suddenly exploded. The Manchurian Candidate, made in 1962 based on a book from 1959, had been withdrawn from circulation after the assassination of John Kennedy and only re-released in the 1980s, which was when I finally saw it. As I staggered out of the Brattled Theater, having seen the film, I felt as if I had been hit by lightning. The text on the video box described the plot as once unbelievable, now unthinkable. That was precisely my situation. I couldn't believe because I couldn't think. But now suddenly, aided by this bizarre plot, which was actually drawn from conversations with CIA experimenters, I started to think. What if Frank had neither fallen nor jumped? What if he had gone out the window by his own action, but not by his own volition? In other words, what if Frank had been programmed to throw himself out the window on signal, just as the Manchurian Candidate's actions had been triggered by seeing the Queen of Diamonds while playing solitaire? It would have been an action for which we don't have a precise vocabulary. He would have thrown himself out the window like an object. But wait, if he had thrown himself, then another option was possible too, one which I had never allowed myself to seriously contemplate or even posit. He could have been pushed. Suddenly the old fall or jump binary had been exploded. Once you have programmed as the unmarked variant of jumped, then it becomes possible to imagine pushed as the marked variant of fell. The full set of possibilities needed to be fall or jump, pushed or programmed. When laid out in a quaternary structure, the scenario suddenly became thinkable in a way it had never been before. And so, too, did its implication for me. I knew what I had to do. At some point, I would have to exhume the body. It turns out the semiotic square has been systematically investigated by a French semiotician named A.J. Grimas, whose work ended up influencing me a lot. The fell, jumped, pushed, programmed. So what's at stake in this business beyond the question of what happened to Frank Olson? Why does any of this matter? The answer, in my view, is that nothing less than a far-reaching theory and method of personal transformation is at stake in this. During these years, I was constantly thinking about what I was seeing in what I now call the collage process. One of the most important of those collages was one I called the collage of the disappearing Harlequin. At the center of this collage, there was an image, which you see on the top here, which was a Picasso painting of a fat harlequin and a scrawny kid sitting on the knee. And at one point, the person who made this collage went up to the collage itself and said, "You see what you can do? You can tuck this part of the picture behind the background." A little bit later, she said, "Now what you can do is you can go back and pull it up again." In Jakobson's view of language, within a pair of terms, the difference between the one that is unmarked and the one that is regarded as natural, the default, and the one that must be chosen and is therefore marked makes all the difference. In fact, the ability to make that distinction is fundamental to how language operates. So the question in the collage tuck, which creates a difference, is which position is the default, which is the starting point, and which is the variation. As soon as we ask that question, we have not 2 terms, but 4. And as soon as we have 4 terms, we have a nodal switching center able to recategorize other elements by linking them to its own permutations. A relativity machine which creates integration and generates consciousness and which points toward the future, toward the capacity to generate new perspectives and new self-narratives as the novel elements are continually ingested into the matrix of the self. The wide range of insights from psychoanalysis to neuroscience to semiotics, phenomenology, and literary theory must be called upon to fathom what occurs in this simple shift in self-representation becomes a vehicle for recategorizing all the elements that comprise one's world. So here again, you come back to the original collage and you'll see at the center this image that I've been talking about. And you see what happens when it's tucked behind the background. And you see what happens when it comes back out again. What was amazing in this is that as this central image went through these permutations of being tucked and untucked, it was as if the entire collage was suddenly revalorized, and all the other images took on some kind of a new meaning. It was as if you had entered a totally different landscape simply by that action. And what this means is that you suddenly have a means of unfolding an impacted term within a configuration. So this is what the setup looked like that I eventually created, where we did this with the aid of a number of projectors and a dissolve control, so that you could go back and forth between these positions and even introduce intermediary terms, kind of a fade gradient between the poles of these oppositions. And as you did that, as a central image went through these this flip-flopping, but also in these intermediate positions introduced by a fade gradient between the two images, you would draw in other images that seemed to be elicited by positions in this central opposition. So this is sort of structurally how it looks. And if I quote for a moment from a guy named Frederick Jameson, who's a professor of literature at Duke, who has written extensively about this process of the semiotic square. He says, the famous semiotic square is for many of us the supreme achievement of Grimasian semiotics. Here we finally open up the black box through which narrative is somehow converted into cognition and vice versa. Finally, we have the equations. We can witness the processes of transfer, which need no longer be posited mythically before us, since it is visible in front of our eyes. But he says a final warning must be directed to the peculiar nature of the fourth term, the negation of the negation in the lower left here. This must be, when the operation is successful, the place of novelty and a paradoxical emergence. It is always the most critical position and the one that remains open or empty for the longest time, for its identification completes the process and in that sense constitutes the most creative act of construction. It is simply a matter of experience that the first three terms are relatively given and demand no great acts of intellection, but the fourth one is the place of the great leap, the great deduction, the intuition that falls from the ceiling or from heaven. So this introduced me to a way of understanding the relation between self-representations and object representations in a dynamic configuration. And this again draws upon some of the theory for which British psychoanalysis has been an important source. And ultimately this has to do with recategorization, which is fundamental to identity creation and actually to the formation of consciousness. So now we're going to approach all this from yet another direction. In college, I became fascinated by the writings of the Danish philosopher theologian Soren Kierkegaard and read everything by him that was available in English at that time. Many of his ideas interested me, but especially perhaps his well-known mantra that life must be understood backwards but lived forwards. As he said, philosophers are fond of saying that life must be understood backwards, but they forget to add that it must be lived forwards. As I saw that the collage process seemed to move from the collage itself to another phase entirely, I began to realize that there was in fact a diachronic aspect to this process, a structural sequence that unfolded in separate phases. And this aspect responded to something else I was personally struggling with, namely, how do you handle heavy doses of truth? The response to that problem brought me back to my old question about Kierkegaard. that life must be understood forwards, must be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. I can't think of a better example of this than the famous exchange between Jack Nicholson and Tom Cruise about truth and one's capacity to confront it.
Your Honor, you've doctored the logbook. Consider yourself a gentleman. Colonel Jessup, did you order the code red? You don't have to answer that question.
I'll answer the question. You want answers? I think I'm entitled. You want answers?
I want the truth.
You can't handle the truth.
So my question is, the truth that I was having to deal with, who the fuck could handle it? And I began to think of the following idea. Is it possible to send a spark through the cognitive system that ignites the absorptive process? The further I traveled along this road, the more I wanted to start my life over again, knowing from the beginning, or at least much earlier, what I knew now. This wasn't about insight. I wanted a process of acquiring knowledge to be inseparable from the process of reprogramming the cognitive machinery which had been put out of play by a series of events which I had not understood, and by their implications and reverberations which proliferated in all directions. I felt the pain of Thomas Hobbes' brutal dictum, "Hell is truth seen too late." The implication is that somehow we have to reconcile cognitive development, or learning in a profound sense, which moves forward, with confrontation with the past, which lies behind and requires introspection. But how? The famous scholar of myth and religion, Mircea Eliade, had put it well in speaking of classical forms of transformation. The conception underlying ancient curative rituals, Eliade wrote, seems to be the following. Life cannot be repaired. It can only be recreated through symbolic repetition of the cosmogony, for the cosmogony is the paradigmatic model for all creation. What is involved, in short, is a return to the original time, the therapeutic purpose of which is to begin life once again, a symbolic rebirth. How should we think about this? And one way I've begun to think about it borrows from a notion from Margaret Lowenfeld, who again is a British psychoanalyst who worked here for decades, who wrote, if instead of beginning with conscious, that is, by being confronted by the adult in whom consciousness and cognition are fully developed and with whom one looks backward to the unconscious, we start with the infant, in whom cognitive faculties are not yet developed, and look forward to cognition, then the reverse of the usual process arises. The strange part of the mind, the fantasy part, is what confronts us. This is now the norm, and the problem before us is this. How and why does the cognitive system arise? So here you have a secular version of myth, a developmental psychology. And the question is, how can you apply Lowenfeld's insight about beginning with the unconscious and moving to consciousness, or beginning with embodiment, beginning with the earlier forms of cognition and moving to more advanced forms, instead of what usually happens in psychological processes, which is we begin with the more advanced forms and move backward to the less developed forms. This is what I began calling the question of ontological recapitulation. Is there a way of beginning at the beginning rather than at the end? And is there a way of beginning at the beginning and moving forward? In other words, in a certain sense, traversing the brain from back to front, from the limbic system, from the visual cortex in the back of the brain to the linguistic centers in the midbrain, to the prefrontal cortex and the centers of decision-making, of narrative, of thinking about the future, of discourse, and of abstract reasoning. Is there a way of setting up a process that actually does that? Now we take a little diversion before coming back to that question and asking, what happens to psychological theory when the murder of the father is no longer a fantasy? Here we get to the opposition between Oedipus and Hamlet. And why should it be that the murder of the father and the question of how we address that murder is a pivot point, in a way, a kind of a hinge in the whole history of psychological understanding? Oedipus is the man who has done it. Hamlet is the man who has yet to do it. We have retroactive guilt versus prospective enactment. Symbols versus symbolization. Working through versus understanding forward. Working through versus ontological recapitulation. So what happened was, after I had exhumed my father's body, and here I am with his skull in a box where I was taking it to be looked at by a team of forensic scientists, I began to understand what the cultural historian Karl Schorsky meant by postmodern man. The man who is faced with the collapse of existing symbols. One of the founding documents of modern subjectivity is, of course, the theses that Martin Luther nailed to the door of the church at Wittenberg. The modern idea of individual conscience, which arises over and against these institutions which will always claim exceptional status, dates from Luther's refusal to submit to the Catholic Church, which, like the CIA in the 1950s, argued that it could do whatever was necessary to fight evil. Ironically enough, on the last Sunday night of my father's life, he went to see a film about the life of Martin Luther. The next day, he submitted his resignation, at which point he was told he would need to go to New York for treatment. So now we come back to the death of Frank Olson, and we have to ask, what is this thing? Well, how are we going to talk about the category into which it fits? And part of the reason why thinking about this whole matter has been so, in my opinion, primitive and unhelpful is that it's never been named. What are we talking about? And we're back again to the Humpty Dumpty problem, where the whole idea of a covert operation is to intercept thought so no one can figure out what the heck has actually happened. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty together again. So in the case of my father's death, you begin with the notion of accident. You then come to the notion of suicide. You then come to the notion of LSD suicide. You then come to the notion of murder. You then come to the notion of assassination. You then come to the notion, which the Israelis talk about, of a public murder. Then you come to the notion of a national security homicide. And then you come to the notion of a non-judicial execution. This is a confusing array of terms. What adds to the complexity is that the evolution of thought about my father's death has taken place over such a very long span of time. In 1953, it was called an accident. This comes from Frank's boss, Vin Ruet. Was later called an LSD suicide. That was after 19 more years. It was then called a murder in 1994 after 20 more years. Finally, it was called a secret execution. What's interesting about this, in my opinion, is that the space between these various ways of grasping this event fall into roughly 20-year intervals, which is the time that's usually attributed to the notion of generational change. And some theories of historiography, equate the idea of historical change with generational change. And in this case, it almost seems to be true that one needs a generational transformation in order to grasp the next level of this completely, as Errol Morris said, the most fucked up story he'd ever heard in his life. Now this is a diagram that I made simply to try to understand where was my father in terms of a variety of involvements of the government and of his research operation, which could have motivated his murder. What's the motive? And you get this Venn diagram, which places him in arguably the most dangerous spot that you could be in the Cold War. He was right at the middle of all these different things: assassination, materials research, U.S. employment of biological weapons in Korea, which he believed was happening, mind control research and experiments on methods of extreme interrogation. By the way, in terms of this extreme interrogation issue, there's a film that I strongly recommend, Beyond Wormwood, which is Codename Artichoke, made by the German group ARD and a very distinguished journalist named Egmont Koch. It's a great film, and it's available on YouTube. If you search Codename Artichoke on YouTube, you'll find it. Collaboration with former Nazi and Japanese war criminals, terminal experiments, interrogations in Germany, and finally biological warfare experiments in populated areas. Some of this, incidentally, coordinated with Porton Down here in England. So he was involved in one way or another with all of this. And he began to have this kind of what you might call moral backsliding or moral progression, where he decided none of this is right. At which point he becomes dangerous, as Hirsch says in the final episode of Wormwood. I mentioned earlier Karl Schorsky's classic essay by Schorsky. The essay is called Politics and Patricide in the Interpretation of Dreams. And what Schorsky does in this essay is ask the question, why did Freud develop the Oedipal theory as he did, based upon the myth of Oedipus? Why did he do it in terms of the motives that were operative in his own life? And the reason he explains is that Schorsky's father had been very humiliated repeatedly. It's a famous incident where his hat is thrown into the mud, and Freud watches this as a young child. And what Schorsky argues is that Freud needed a theory which would insulate the domain of psychic reality from the domain of political reality, so that you could found a professional practice based not upon politics, but upon psychic exploration. And what Schorsky argues is that this was part of a broader crisis of modernity, in which the intactness of the symbolic world, the symbolic order as it came to be called, can no longer be assumed. Modern man, Schorsky writes, is the one condemned to have to recreate his own universe. And Freud was particularly sensitive to this problem. So he created a theory which enabled that to occur enabled reparation of these insults from the external world to be cured in the psychoanalytic practice and in the psychoanalytic office. My own theory began to diverge from this in a variety of ways. I knew what Schorsky meant by the humiliation of the father and the loss of a feeling of inclusion within the symbolic order because of the nature of the humiliation. In my father's case, it went way beyond humiliation. And the question is, what kind of a theory, what kind of a method beyond classical psychoanalysis might address that broader notion, which is no longer strictly a matter of psychotherapy or psychoanalysis. It's really the problem of living in the modern world. And the argument that I started to come to, or the insight that I began, was that the collage process creates such a model and such a paradigm. One of the famous people who's written, or not famous, but established artists and for teachers, who's written about this is someone named Donald Weissman, who's a professor at the University of Texas, who said, "The operations I experience in making my collages have proved to be the models for what I do and much of what I have done with just about all the bits and pieces and stuff and things and events and occasions of the entire life I live." So that picture that you just saw was a graphic designer with whom I worked in Stockholm, creating this diagram to illustrate what I had begun to see in the collage process, which is, in a word, that it recreates the logic of development. If you think of development as a kind of an original spiral, which is continually recreated later on, as the forms of symbolization are reconstituted and reenacted, then you might think of that there must be some kind of a process which has the form of, not the literal content of, but the form of the original process of psychological development. And now we're thinking of psychological development as occurring across the whole period from birth to, let's say, maturity, early 20s or mid-20s. And that process falls into three distinct domains. The first one is what Piaget would call the stage of thinking with the body, the stage of embodiment. The second is what he, again following Piaget, what he calls stage of semiosis and language acquisition. And the third down here is the stage of conceptualization, formal operations, abstract thought. And it turned out, as I began working more and more with this collage process, that lo and behold, it had this process in its structure. And it was not an interpretive process. The aim was not to interpret these collages. The aim, as Wittgenstein would say, was to use them to generate this forward-moving regeneration of the psyche itself. And this is why one of the people who worked through this process said that experience had what he called propulsive intensity. And I recognize the truth of that, but it took a long time to realize why he might say that. Well, if in fact it had this logic, of course it's going to have propulsive intensity. So now we come, well, what's the difference between what we usually think of as collage and what I'm calling the collage method? What's the difference? And here we come to a quotation from a German art theorist who I recently heard is still alive, though he made this observation quite long ago. In the collage, our modern method of thinking in which reality only becomes understandable when interpreted by human intelligence is epitomized in an abbreviated model which is itself graspable by consciousness. I mean, that's a hell of an idea. And it's actually what I had started to see in my own work with this method. Franz Mohn, Prinzip Collage, 1968. So I ended up making this kind of configurational representation of the various functions and dimensions which are embodied in the collage process, because I wanted a way of understanding Franz Mohn's notion that consciousness is recapitulated in this experience. Well, what are the dimensions of that? So this particular image gives you a sense of what some of those things are. And compared with the conventional notion of collage, what I'm talking about is bigger. It's on the scale of the whole body. It has larger images. It's fuller, meaning it's a virtual life space map. It's longer. It's deeper, it's chiasmic, it's propulsive, and it's generative. By bigger, I mean that it's made on the scale of the whole body, so the body's ways of knowing are actually in the thing. It's incredible. When you start to deal with large photographs and you move from the tabletop onto the floor, it's a completely different experience because the body's ways of orientating itself in space are now embedded in this configuration. And we know from recent work in cognitive psychology and neuroscience that the whole basis of memory is largely spatial. But how do you get at that unless you have a spatial method? Well, this is the method. It's fuller. There's more images. It's much wider. There's more multiplicity in it. I mean, these things are, you know, at least 6 or 8 feet large, square, or whatever shape they may take, but they're on the scale of the whole body. So there's a lot of images in them. Also, what I'm talking about is longer, meaning diachronically longer. It's a process. It's not a fixed representation. It's not a picture. It's a process, and it's the process which has a structure. It's also broader. This is what I call the human interface. It involves the body system, it involves the social system, language, communication, and involves the image system or phenomenology. So it's a very, very rich medium. So it's broader, but it's also deeper, meaning it has reverberation, resonance back and forth between earlier traversals of this trajectory and now the recreation of it. There's tremendous resonance in it, which I call generative transference. It also has all kinds of left-right brain crossovers between image-based and word-based communication. These things are constantly moving back and forth in a way which is actually incredible. It's also propulsive, by which I mean it's forward-moving. It's not retroactive, retrospective. It's generative, and it moves forward with a great energy and propulsion. Finally, it's generative, and this is what I mean by ontological recapitulation. It generates a whole series of functions, not because of interpretation, not because of the wit or the intelligence of the interpreter, but because the process itself generates functions. And so it recreates the whole psychic process by its very logic. This is a clip of a colleague with whom I've worked for many years, commenting on this process in Wormwood.
And I trudged my way over to this apartment of this guy, Eric Olson, hoping to get paid a little bit to cut photographs out of this giant pile of Time Life books. He had selected key images that he thought would work well in this scanning book, from which people would grab images that sort of struck them. The scanning book itself was a fabulous object, giant book, maybe 3 feet by 2 feet, and opens out. You can see totally various images. Over here is a fire, over here is a face, over here is a jungle, over here is a nude, over here is a boxer's face being contorted with the punch, over here is an atomic detonation. It took another 3 years or so before we rented the apartment on Ellery Street. That became the collage house of our kind of laboratory. If you're a traditional psychotherapist, all you need is a quiet room and a couple of chairs. To do this stuff, you have to have an immense amount of physical wherewithal. Just getting these images was, of course, a very big thing. Eric knew this person connected to Time Life books, who, with the stroke of a pen, could have 1,000 of them delivered to his apartment. The first collage he ever made, just playing around late at night. It's very simple, it was very quickly put together. In the middle, there is an image of a building. A body is in mid-fall. At the bottom of the building, there is a clock. He was unaware when he made it of the connection between this image and his own father's death. And it kind of washed over him with a sort of jolt of revelation. Oh my God, it's my father. Something like that experience is at the heart of this whole work with collage.
When I came back from Sweden, having been away for 3 years, he said, I think it's time that we look into this matter again. So here is a representation of the stages of this process, which build a sort of metaphor of the growth of the mind itself in a series of modular increments. Get a box, scan and grasp, make piles, crawl and configure, scan and speak, picture the pictures, make image strings, and double dissolve and disperse. This arc has an incredible coherence, and this is what I'm talking about by using the term propulsive intensity. Over the course of this trajectory, these blocks are suffused with particularity. This is the idea of generative transference. Namely, accessing the deep structures of the human developmental algorithm while using the images of everyday life to do so. Which means that the events of one's life are reconfigured in a formative sequence. This is incredibly powerful. In a way, the whole process is like a rebirth, a starting over at the beginning rather than at the end of the formative trajectory, which builds the capacity for symbolization. This is what I mean by the term I used earlier, understanding forwards. And all of that is what I tried to capture in this configurational representation of the functions elicited by this process. So the collages themselves, I really don't like the word collage at all. I now think of them as now slices, the way that term is used in physics. They're just cross sections of the experience that someone's having in this moment. And these are some of the collages over years that people have made. And you can see how incredibly individual they are, completely different from each other in the way they're structured and organized. Okay, so this process is spatialized in a number of different senses, and one of the ways it's spatialized is that it needs the space of different rooms in order to occur. And this is where a comment by the great Gaston Bachelard, French literary theorist, talked about the house. In his book, The Poetics of Space, he says the house is one of the greatest powers of integration for the thoughts and memories and dreams of mankind. This was the house which I established in Cambridge for this process. There's Bachelard's quote. And this place had a series of rooms, the movement among which reflected the structure of the process itself, so that it acted both as a facilitating environment, but also as a kind of mnemonic for what you were experiencing in each of these spaces. It was an incredibly powerful thing. And it finally also gave me an idea of how you move from the diabolic to the symbolic to the metabolic. You take an image which in itself, in isolation, is incredibly insidious and destructive. You begin to put it into a context where it speaks to other images. You have a movement toward the symbolic. But then you put that into a process which is localized in differentiated spaces, and you have a kind of metabolism, kind of symbolic metabolism occurring, which is extremely powerful and I think useful in a variety of different settings. So now, we're kind of over time already, but we're going to take a little pause here to go into the final stage of all this, which was what happened with Seymour Hersh. As you know, Hersh, if you've seen Wormwood, Hersh was involved in the 1970s, but then I went back to see him in 2014. And in terms of what happened with him, I think of James Starr's comment. James Starr was a professor of forensic scientists at George Washington University who, by an amazing coincidence, the family knew. He specializes in exhuming bodies to resolve, historical cases. And what are the chances that you're going to have a personal family friend who does such a thing? Anyway, that we did. And he said, when you pull on the Frank Olson case, you feel something very big is pulling back. So with the incident with Seymour Hersh, what happened was I went back to see him in 2014. And this is the part that's left out of Wormwood, which I think without knowing this, you don't know what the hell to make of what happens in the 6th episode. And I've gotten emails from all over the world saying, what the hell is that about? Did you get to the end or did you not? What happened was this guy, who I'm going to say his name is Bernard McMahon, as I found out who the hell he is, and I actually went to his house and met him. This is Hersh's deepest source, Bernard McMahon. He has very deep roots in the intelligence community. And he, in 2002, in other words, right after 9/11, he was in a small working group with none other than Dick Cheney. And Dick Cheney had convened a small working group, which nobody knows about. No one's heard of this. The journalists in Washington don't even know about it. He convened a small working group to think about, if you start to, quote, walk the dark side, which is what he said after 9/11, we're going to have to walk the dark side, what could go wrong? What could go wrong? If you start renditions, black sites, extreme interrogations, murder, all of this stuff, what could go wrong? What kind of blowback could you have? Well, it turns out, what was in his mind was what he had seen when he was in the White House, and we show up from these revelations that came out in the Rockefeller Commission, and we want to know what happened. So now we come back to Hersh. But to understand this, you have to know who this source is and why this source would have any information. And it turns out he got the information because, as with the moment in 1953 when my father was murdered, so also after 9/11, the intelligence services were off the chain. They could do whatever they wanted. And Cheney wanted to know what he might be up against if he pursued this path. And he knew the whole story from 1975, 40 years earlier, or he knew enough to know that there was a story that was important to know, and he knew where it was. It turns out in Washington there is something called the medical records. It has nothing to do with medicine. It's a vault. Nobody knows about it. Hersh had never heard about it before. It's a place that requires presidential authorization to get into it. Cheney authorized this guy to go into the medical records, get the Olson file, read it, take notes on it, come back and tell us what's in it.
Is it in a box? I don't know. Is it in a file just on a bookshelf? I don't know. Is it in a file drawer? I don't know. I'm just amazed that it's anywhere. And I'm amazed that this guy would then tell Hersh about it. He had gone to a place, and I don't know where, but somewhere in the deepest of the deep vaults, and had found a document which described exactly what had happened in this incident in detail. And this source had then taken notes on this document and had recited those notes to Soren Kierkegaard.
I believe he was killed. I reasonably believe he was killed, but I can't prove it. There's a crucial fact that would make the case, but it would also finger people, so I can't do it.
Yeah, well, I can.
I'm trying very hard to get further information, and I probably will eventually.
Yeah, and the crucial fact you need to know is that this guy was a close associate of Dick Cheney, and this took place. The reason this is so important to me is not merely that it clinches the notion that my father was not murdered, not assassinated, but executed, but also because it puts it back into historical context again. The reason this came to light was because of 9/11, was because of the crisis of secret interrogation and the whole kind of bag of stuff that they call walking the dark side. Without that, you know, it wouldn't, this entry into the vault would not have happened. This guy who Hirsch approached wouldn't have known, and it wouldn't be possible for me right now to tell you what this is all about.
His first book back in the 60s was on biological and chemical warfare. And then he does this other work on the CIA and all this stuff, which leads to these committee hearings and everything else. The whole arc of his career from beginning till now is part of this story. And his whole kind of identity is wrapped up with being this guy who doesn't buy the bullshit. But in this case, he bought the farm completely, and until last year when I told him this is a myth, and he didn't like hearing it, and I don't think he liked hearing from his source, his very much trusted source, that Eric is right and you're wrong.
And what they do, what Errol Morris does in this film is he uses this image of billiard balls without telling you what the billiard balls represent. What the billiard balls represent is this extreme unlikelihood that the very guy Hirsch went to would be the guy that Dick Cheney dispatched into the archive in the wake of 9/11 to find out what actually happened to Frank Olson. Now that's extraordinary. And once you hear that, you go, you can't make this shit up, you know? This is it, and that was my feeling when we're in this, you know, when we're in this dark bar. Then the sign of the whale is like, well, this is the way it ends. You talk to some journalist who got the truth. He tells you, that's it. That's it. This is how it feels to reach bottom here. And it brought it full circle, which has been the structure of this story the whole time. You come back to Dick Cheney. The nefarious Dick Cheney, who was key in the cover-up of the 70s and now is the guy who actually gets this information. And the way we know the role that he played in the 70s was because I got hold of all these documents from the Gerald Ford White House, exchanges between him and Rumsfeld about needing to get the Frank Olson case, you know, derailed. The charming Dick Cheney. So it's all about the dark side.
If you step back, which, you know, obviously is difficult for me to do because there's the whole emotional thing, but if you step back, it's just remarkable that this could even occur. That such a baloney story could fly at all. And that the likes of Seymour Hersh and all these other journalists could buy it. I think that's Hersh's problem now.
The other problem that Hirsch has and anybody has with this story is the notion of national security homicide is completely off the table for discussion in Washington. Nobody has ever looked into it systematically at all. And as soon as you raise it, it's not only that you're on the verge of conspiracy theory in a very negative sense, you're also kind of excommunicated from the community of people who anybody wants to talk to. That's the problem. This is not a subject that can be addressed in Washington and it doesn't matter if you're a progressive journalist, a conservative journalist, you don't talk about this, period. And the only cases that are known are, you know, circumstantial. There was a suspicious death here, there was a suspicious death there. What's unique about my father's case is it's the converse of the assassination of John Kennedy. In Kennedy's case, we know he was murdered, but we don't know who did it. In my father's case, if he was murdered, we do know who did it because the CIA was in the room. Unless you're going to say that the mob came in and muscled them out of the way, you're going to have to say they were involved in this. And all of this is why I call it the end of the affair. I mean, it's not a happy ending. How could it be? But it's the end. I mean, it's just like, it was a certain moment that kind of was the mirror image of what happened in November '53, where you finally hit bottom with this thing. And it's a nasty bottom, but that's what it was. Now here's the CV, if you want to call it that, of this guy, Bernard McMahon, who was the guy who Hirsch went to. He's a retired Navy captain. He came from a very distinguished Navy family. He was the executive director of the CIA under Stansfield Turner. He was staff director of the Senate Intelligence Committee. He was advisor to Dick Cheney on this secret working group. He's been an advisor to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and particularly to Martin Dempsey. And he's president of a company called Triton Systems, which Hearst initially told me made him financially independent so he wouldn't be worried if this story came out. Hearst later revised that to say this guy McMahon is the only guy whose finger is in the dike of chaos in the Middle East. If he's exposed, the Middle East is going to completely devolve. So he's the only guy who stands between us and chaos in the Middle East. Well, okay, maybe so. Then we'll risk some chaos in the Middle East, I guess. Now this is an interesting comment.
Suspicious death. The mechanism of this process, if I'm right that he was done in, there was a mechanism. It wasn't ad hoc.
What do you mean by a mechanism?
See, I knew you'd ask that question. What do you mean by what do you mean? A mechanism. There was a procedure.
A procedure to eliminate undesirable...
Why not? If you have a dissident in a system, maybe you have a procedure for dealing with it. And maybe some of the people who wrote some of the reports were involved in the procedure. Maybe it was all one big frantic cover-up.
Yeah. Yeah. So if all this sounds stunningly, staggeringly contemporary, that's because it is. It's so contemporary, in fact, that we come. Well, we'll wait for just a second on this. I want you to see this little clip also.
Me and all that. He's not been illogical about me. He's right about me. I'm holding back something for him for a reason he doesn't think is worthy. He knew it didn't happen the way they said it happened. He knew that right away. And they did the best they could to muffle it. But they're very good at that. They invented a story. The fact that you can't get closure in this thing will be of great satisfaction to the CIA. The old timers, they'll love it. They'll love it. The tradecraft won. They got away with one. Even though a few people may know what happened, so what? Nobody else does. It's a victory for them. You know, mark up one for them, 0 for us on this one. But don't you know how wonderful it is to not have an ending? I think you're really wrong to want this pretty little thing bowed up and tied. It's wonderful not to have an ending.
Yeah, it's wonderful. I mean, what you see here is so maddening because the irony of it is we do have an ending. It's just that it's not in the ending of this bloody film. And Hirsch was instrumental in achieving that ending, but you can see it's a very interesting psychological phenomenon that happens here. That it's like what I call identity flipping or identity flutter. You're not quite sure whether he's on the side of those who want to expose the truth or those who are very complacent about the fact that the truth has not been exposed because it's a good thing. It's a good thing how exactly? Well, because that's the way history works. We wouldn't want this case to work any differently than the way history generally works, so this is a great thing. This is a paradigm of how history works. You never know what's going on. In this case, we do know what's going on. It's very clear. But he doesn't want to take responsibility for that. And one of the I guess from the standpoint of investigative journalism, this is very important because Hirsch always brags about the fact that he has sources that no one else has. One of the reasons he has these sources is because he identifies with them and shares a lot of their values. But here you come to the ultimate value. Do you kill your own citizens when they threaten to expose illegal, immoral operations? What do you do then? Well, that is, there you're again coming back to Freud. You're at the whole very issue of the constituent fact of the formation of the polity, which is the prevention of murder. And this is from Totem and Taboo. But if the state starts committing murder, you have a genuine, a secret murders of its own citizens. You have a crisis of the social contract, which goes all the way to the bottom. Yeah. So this is a kind of a closing kind of a thought here, which is the Jamal Khashoggi case really recapitulates this in a staggering way. And just this week, Monday, I read this in the New York Times. A person familiar with Saudi plans said the kingdom was likely to say that the killing was an accident committed by rogue Saudi agents, not an assassination ordered from Riyadh. The Saudi version of the story will probably be that officials intended to interrogate and abduct Mr. Khashoggi, spiriting him back to Saudi Arabia, but that they botched the job, killing him instead. This person said, speaking on the condition of anonymity because the Saudi officials had yet to talk publicly about their plans. That's from this week. Now, this is a book that came out in 2009, a 700-page book about my father's death and a lot of other stuff. And let me read you one paragraph about the death itself, which is handled in a couple of very small paragraphs. The whole book is about a huge amount of stuff. It's what the CIA would call flooding the zone with an incredible torrent of stuff. But the treatment of the death is minuscule, and this is what it boils down to. Details of what happened the night that Olson died are still somewhat vague because neither Alpert nor Neal, two sources that this author relied upon, code names for these two sources, neither of these would go into specific details. At some point during Olson's last night in New York, Neal explained, Lashbrook, who was the CIA guy with him at the time, had become concerned that, quote, Olson was once again becoming unhinged, unquote. Before Olson and Lashbrook retired for the night, the decision was made that it would be best if Olson were transported back to Maryland for confinement at Chestnut Grove, as Abramson, the CIA-connected doctor, had recommended, but by means other than the conventional flight Lashbrook had booked for the next day. The alternative plan involved Lafitte and Spirito, two thugs who this guy argues were the killers. Lafitte and Spirito, apparently as personal escorts for Olson, said one source. George White would have been the ideal alternative, perhaps along with Lafitte, but he was in California. That Spirito had just been released from prison in Atlanta, where he had been a subject to Dr. Carl Filfer's psychotic experiments, was either overlooked or unknown. quote, I don't think anyone knew where he had come from or where he had been. He was recruited by Lafitte, said this other guy, Albert. According to Albert and Neil, when a late night attempt was made to move a subdued Olson from the room to transport him by automobile to Maryland, things went drastically wrong. The short and entire explanation is that, quote, Olson resisted, and in the ensuing struggle, he was pitched through the closed window. Pitched? It seemed an odd word, pitched. Does that mean thrown or pushed? It may not be the correct word, but it will have to suffice. Anyone can imagine that in such situations, things can become confusing. I mean, it's incredible. The fit between these two paragraphs, these two accounts of secret murder are just astounding. But was the intent to murder Olson? The intent was initially to remove him from the hotel without incident and take him back to Maryland where he would be tucked away and further assessment would be allowed so as to decide what to do with him. Jesus. So the thing about the story of my father's murder, it never gets old. It's always new. It always speaks to whatever happened because it's such a kind of paradigmatic event in the way governments deal with extreme crisis. Whether they're Saudis, whether they're Americans, whatever, this is what you do, and then you concoct a story. And we're going to see what story is finally settled upon by the Saudis in collaboration with Donald Trump. But it's going to take, you know, they're either going to pin it on the head of one of the prominent intelligence guys, or it's going to be an accident or whatever. But you see the kind of machinations. The difference is it's being enacted in broad daylight. You see them struggling with the PR aspect of this. So we come now, I didn't think we'd make it through all this, but we come to the code of this, which is what I call Soul Book. And it's how the collage process really leads. It's kind of an anti-Facebook dimension of all this. Instead of proliferating connections among people with whom one might or might not know, intended to create which it creates overstimulation and depression, the collage work is something different, which is about inner linkages among things that make one feel genuinely alive. One guy who went through this process said the following: your thought seems to move concepts of artistic process from the realm of the marginalized but extraordinary to the realm of the necessary and inevitable human activity of mind, perhaps a definition of soul. And again, the quote that I mentioned to you before, where somebody went through this, said, I felt as if I was being carried on several currents. The process had a life force of its own, and I was made part of that. So this brings us really to the conclusion of the talk. And for me, I felt 2 years ago when they suddenly were able to record the sound coming from the collapse of black holes 1 billion years ago by the gravitational waves that were set in motion, I began to think that there was something that I was doing which was a little bit akin to that, in the sense that you were picking up what I called ontological waves from the formation of the human subject, and that's what this was really all about. And that what I had created was not a microscope, it was a kind of an antenna. So that's it. Thanks for sticking with all this.